Hello, I'm Jeremy, and welcome to another episode of Jeremy U's Reviews, where mistreated movies get a second chance. I've seen a lot of stuff recently, so let's start the year off with another mini reviews. Enjoy! So I recently saw both Knives Out movies, and they're pretty interesting. Let's start with the first one. Now, I am a massive fan of murder mysteries. I adore the Clue movie. I've been to just about every In Living Black and White play at the Pegasus Theater. I love See How They Run, and I enjoy Holmes and Watson, even if it has a ton of flaws. And as a murder mystery fan, I really like the way Rian Johnson tackles the genre. The dialogue is probably the best part of the film, as not only are there some solid lines, but it really sells the feel of a murder mystery novel. It has the same kind of immersive vibe as book dialogue, without feeling like it's over-explaining things, and it really gives Knives Out a great feel. As for the characters, they're very cool. Let's start with Benoit Blanc. Blanc is a pretty interesting detective character. Outside of his role as James Bond, I don't really have any experience with Daniel Craig as an actor, although, funnily enough, I'll be reviewing a Bond film later in this video. But in Knives Out and Glass Onion, he does a great job. I will admit that his accent is very off-putting at first, but as the film goes on, you get used to it, and it makes for an interesting contrast to Blanc's otherwise straight-laced demeanor. Blanc is a very uptight and professional kind of guy. Not really a fuddy-duddy, but still generally professional and astute. And not only does that make him a solid detective character, but it also makes him a solid contrast to the more brash and outspoken Thrombes. Overall, a pretty good character. Marta is also pretty solid. She's pretty likable and sympathetic, and the way she balances off the other characters is interesting and effective. Not an incredibly complex character, but still interesting. And then we have the Thrombes. These people make the family and Violent Night look functional. Literally, every member of this family is a dick. But what makes them work is that, one, the film knows that they're dicks, and two, they're all different flavors of dick. Harlan, the man whose murder kickstarts the movie, is probably the closest Thromby member to being a good person, aside from his mother, but she's not really that important outside of a few scenes. As the scenes with Harlan and Marta show that he does have a sweet side, but he's still not a fully good person. Linda, played very well by Jamie Lee Curtis, is very cold and unsympathetic towards other people. Jacob is a right-wing troll, and as Kyle Nordy points out in his Best Films of 2019 list, which I put a link to in the description, is largely pointless to the film overall, outside of a few scenes. Richard is an unfaithful cheater. Walt is a cynical money grabber who just wants to take advantage of Harlan's work instead of making his own. And then we have my personal favorite of the Thrombes, Ransom. The minute Ransom entered the movie, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be my favorite character. I am a sucker for the not giving an F character. Characters like Dr. Cox from Scrubs and Sophia from the Golden Girls that aren't fully terrible people, but are sarcastic as heck, have no filter, and say whatever they want. And while unlike Cox and Sophia, Ransom is a terrible person, he's just as funny as those two. Chris Evans does an amazing job capturing the essence of the character, and he has some genuinely really funny moments. That eat poop scene is easily the funniest and most quotable moment of the movie. Just a fantastic character all around. And speaking of funny, let's talk about the humor. Well, not the funniest movie ever made, Knives Out is still pretty funny. There's some legit, really humorous lines, clever moments, and some enjoyable dynamics between the various characters, especially Blanc. Blanc steals the show in almost every scene he's in, and it makes sense why Glass Onion gave him a lot more focus. Finally, the mystery element. There's a small subset of people that hate the Knives Out films, both because they're directed by the guy who directed The Last Jedi, and because of the way the mysteries are executed. For the former, all I have to say is, I've never seen The Last Jedi and don't plan plan on it, ever seeing it. But, and you have the right to dislike it, but you shouldn't let one bad movie taint your view of a director. After all, good directors can make bad movies, and bad directors can make good movies. And for the latter, I'll go more in depth with this when I get to the Glass Onion segment in a few minutes. But the short version is, I honestly don't mind the way Rian Johnson handles mysteries. What makes Knives Out work is how it takes so many twists and turns. It's not just, oh, there's a murder, let's solve it. There's a lot of twists and turns taken in the story that reveal more about the Thrombies and give layers to what's really going on. And sure, there are some things you can criticize with the plot, like why did Harlan make Marta go on this wild goose chase instead of simply calling 911 and saying that he messed up? But the thing about Knives Out is how, with the unorthodox way the story is presented, you don't really notice stuff like that. Overall, while not the best murder mystery movie ever, that would be Clue, Knives Out is still a really solid, entertaining murder mystery movie. The comedy is solid, the characters are interesting, the atmosphere is potent. Lakeith Stanfield, who also played Cash in Sorry to Bother You, who has an appearance as Detective Lieutenant Elliot, and it's a really cool and effective movie that's definitely worth a watch. Again, not for everyone, but still really solid, and I don't know why I didn't watch this when it first came out in 2019. Really solid film. Check it out. And now we have the second and most recent in this duology, Glass Onion. And while not as good as Knives Out, Glass Onion is still really solid. Let's start with the characters. These characters are honestly really fun. I already explained my thoughts on Blanc in the previous segment, so let's talk about the Disruptors. They're characters you'll either enjoy or be royally pissed at. And I like them. They're kind of like the gang from It's Always Sunny, in that they're likably unlikable. While not as interesting as the Thrombies from the first movie, they all have their own unique and enjoyable traits, with Miles being a daft Mark Zuckerberg type, played really well by Edward Norton, Birdie being a privileged fashion designer who's so out of touch with the real world, she thought a sweatshop was a place where they made sweatpants. Like, no, I'm not kidding, that's an actual scene. Duke being a stereotypical over-the-top right-wing Twitch streamer. And I like how the fact that he dies first reflects the opening of See How They Run, where Adrian Brody's character mentions how the most unlikable character gets killed off first. I doubt that was an intentional parallel. That was intentional, but it's still an interesting parallel nonetheless to Miles' head scientist Lionel, played really well by Leslie Odom Jr., and Connecticut Governor Claire DeBella, who has some solid moments. The only problem with these characters that make them not as good as the Thrombies is their lack of depth. One of the things that makes the Thrombies enjoyable characters is how each member feels like a fully fleshed out character. Even Jacob, who I mentioned earlier is pretty much pointless, still feels like a fully realized character. It's just that he doesn't have a lot of plot relevance. But with Glass Onion, the only members of the Disruptors that feel like fully realized characters are Miles and Duke. Everyone else, while enjoyable, just feels like a basic character trait, with nothing really else about them. Again, they're still enjoyable, but you can definitely feel the downgrade. The humor, on the other hand, is just as funny. While Glass Onion abandons the book-like dialogue from Knives Out in favor of standardly delivered movie dialogue, it does manage to capture the humor of its predecessor really well. By far one of the best strengths of Glass Onion's comedy is how Blanc plays off the Disruptors, where the Thrombies, despite not being geniuses, still possess a reasonable level of intelligence. The Disruptors, with the exception of Lionel, are pretty dim in terms of intelligence. This allows the contrast between Blanc and the Disruptors to be a lot stronger, leading to some legit solid comedy. On top of that, we have some funny lines, interesting bits of absurdity, and Duke giving us some clever satire of over-the-top idiots who confuse being a men's rights activist with being a misogynist. Pretty solid comedy. Finally, once again, we have the mystery element. Okay, so like I said in the previous segment, there is a small subset of people who hate the way Rian Johnson handles his murder mysteries, especially in Glass Onion. In fact, there seems to be two heavily prevalent extremes when it comes to Glass Onion. People like the critical drinker, who think that Rian Johnson is an idiot and that Glass Onion is incredibly stupid but pretends to be smart. And people like Pillar of Garbage, who think that Glass Onion is this grand, incredible art piece with a ton of cleverness and symbolism. And while I like both Drinker and Pillar, I don't really agree with either of them. True, there are some bits of cleverness in Glass Onion, like how the Among Us game Blanc plays at the beginning of the film reflects the events that would transpire throughout the rest of the film. But I don't think Glass Onion's mystery is as grand and artistic as people like Pillar of Garbage make it out to be, nor do I think it's as stupid and idiotic as people like the critical drinker make it out to be. It's a perfectly solid murder mystery execution that, like the first film, has some holes but is overall engaging, competent, and has some enjoyable twists and turns. Although I will admit one thing. The twist with Andy is kind of eh. See, there's another one of the Disruptors, Andy, that I didn't mention earlier because she wasn't really that interesting. And there's a pretty big twist with her that I won't spoil in this video, but if you've seen any video talking about Glass Onion, you probably already know what the twist I'm talking about is. Now, granted, I was spoiled of this twist pretty early, so it wasn't able to have its intended effect on me, but even then, the base idea is kind of cliche. Like the way it plays into the movie itself is perfectly fine, but the basic premise is like played out, and it just comes right out of nowhere. Not a terrible twist, but it's still pretty eh. Overall, while Glass Onion isn't as good as Knives Out, it's still pretty good. The comedy is once again good. Blanc is his awesome self. While the Disruptors are definitely a downgrade from the Thrombies, they're still fun and enjoyable, and the mystery is decent. Knives Out and Glass Onion, while not an amazing duology, are still a decent pair of murder mystery movies that I am glad I checked out. And I really hope we get more adventures of Benoit Blanc soon. Solid series of movies. Hopefully Ryan can continue this level of quality in the future. And now, let's proceed with the non-Knives Out movies, beginning with...
Come on, turn a little faster. Come on, the world will follow after. Come on, because everybody's after love.
When I first saw the trailer for Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I thought to myself, I don't know if I'm interested in a Puss in Boots sequel, but this actually looks pretty solid. And after I saw many different people praise the living bejesus out of this movie, and seeing some pretty cool snippets, I decided to give the film a watch myself. And yeah, all that praise was warranted because Last Wish is amazing. Let's start with the animation, and it's incredible. Where the first Puss in Boots movie uses the same kind of animation as the other Shrek movies, and for those wondering, I have not seen the original Puss in Boots movie, which is one of the reasons I wasn't super interested in this at first. Last Wish has more of a Spider-Verse vibe to it, and it works amazingly. It's incredibly stylized, well made, and makes the action scenes really pop. It's a really cool animation that gives the film a distinct yet awesome look. Also, this movie rivals Everything Everywhere All at Once in terms of high-quality fight scenes. And given how much I adore that movie, that's saying a lot. Every action scene is so energetic, intense, and uses the animation to give them a lot of weight and energy. It's really well-made action that perfectly matches the high energy of the film. As for the comedy, holy cow, is this movie funny. Like, I don't mean in the MCU way, where it's like, oh, that was kind of funny, I guess. No, I mean legit laugh out loud funny. There are so many humorous scenes in this movie, from the montage showing Puss's deaths, which range from as extravagant as getting killed by stampeding bulls to as simple as getting an allergic reaction to some seafood, to the magic locust trying to be Jack Horner's conscience and failing because Jack is genuinely an awful human being, to the test the doctor runs on Puss, especially the leeches, to the countless hilarious lines in this thing. Like, this has no business being as funny as it is. But what really makes this movie amazing is the characters. Before Last Wish, I never really had any strong feelings towards Puss in Boots as a character. Like, I never hated him, but I never really loved him either. I thought he was just okay. But Last Wish really manages to turn this formerly character into a legit really cool anchor for the story. Seeing Puss go from a cocky, confident, and arrogant risk-taker to more cowardly and regretful due to losing 8 of his lives is legit really interesting and gives the character a unique relatability. We know that Puss deserves this due to not valuing any of his lives, but at the same time, we still want to see Puss succeed in the end and find his inner strength because he's still good at heart. And Antonio Banderas is also fantastic as the character. Banderas is perfectly cast, not just because Puss was clearly inspired by Zorro, who Banderas played in the 90s, but because Banderas is able to perfectly capture Puss's arrogance, confidence, and suaveness in a way I don't think anyone else could. Kitty Softpaws, on the other hand, is just okay. Like, I like the way she bounces off the other characters, especially Puss, but as a character on her own, she's just alright. Not great, but not terrible. As for Perito, I can certainly understand someone getting annoyed by him, but I honestly enjoyed the little fella. He's very adorable, has some good lines, contributes well to Puss's arc, and I like how his naive personality contrasts off the more grounded characters around him. But easily the best characters of Last Wish are the villains. Let's start with Death. Death is one of the most praised elements of this movie, and it's not hard to see why, as he's amazing. Death's design is cool, his voice is menacing, he offers a great role in the story, as a personification of the karma Puss is facing due to not valuing any of his lives, and of course, the whistling. This is easily the most scary whistling in a non-horror film I've ever seen. Whenever Death does that creepy whistle, I feel just as scared as Puss does in that moment, even though I'm not in the same universe. There's just such an eerie atmosphere to Death's whistle that makes it an awesome and scary character even more scary and awesome. But as good as Death is, he's not my favorite villain of the film. That would be Jack Horner. I love everything about this character. For one, he's voiced by John Mulaney, who I consider to be one of the best modern comedians. Mulaney is insanely funny, from his awesome stand-up, to his appearances on SNL and Documentary Now, to the underrated awesomeness that is John Mulaney and the Sack Lunch Bunch. Mulaney is just such an insanely funny dude. And in this film, he's great. Mulaney manages to perfectly capture the humor and menace of the character, and he has some legit hilarious lines, especially with the locust.
You're not gonna shoot a puppy, are you, Jack?
Yeah, in the face. Why?
Dear God, that moment just gets funnier every time. And Jack himself is also great. JH is the perfect balance of comedic and menacing, managing to be absolutely hilarious and incredibly terrifying without becoming too scary or too goofy. And I also like his motivation as a character. Taking a forgettable nursery rhyme character and turning him into a hilariously evil maniac who became evil because Pinocchio was more popular than him is 100% in the spirit of Shrek. And it combines with his humor, menace, and awesome voice actor to make Jack Warner an amazing villain. Just a great character all around. Rounding out the villains, we have Goldilocks and the Three Bears Crime Family. While not as good as Death or Jack Warner, I like these four. You can really feel the family dynamic between Goldilocks and the bears, and like Jack, they managed to capture a balance between being funny and being threatening very well. And the arc that Goldie goes through trying to find a family and realizing that the bears gave her a family the whole time is legit really well executed and fits with the themes of the movie well. Also, I totally thought that baby bear was voiced by James Corden. Like Samson K.O. was doing a really good James Corden impression. Finally, the themes. Last Wish gets into some pretty heavy themes. The film heavily deals with the concept of morality and trust in other people, and it executes both themes phenomenally. It shows how trust in other people is important, and even if you only have one life, you can still value that life to the fullest. It's really impressive stuff and shows that kids' movies can be just as deep as the stuff made for adults. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is a phenomenal movie that has something for everyone. For animation lovers, it has great animation. For action lovers, it has phenomenal fight scenes. For those who mainly focus on characters, it has a great cast of characters. For those who love humor, like myself, it has some awesome comedy. And for those who want some emotional moments, it has some great themes and plot development. If you haven't seen this movie already, please do, as it's honestly amazing. Between this and The Bad Guys, DreamWorks is definitely on a hot streak that I hope they continue into the coming year. Great movie. Check it out. So, I have mixed feelings on The Towering Inferno. Let's start with the good stuff. The acting is amazing. This film rivals Mars Attacks in terms of having a huge amount of talented actors, and they all do amazingly. Steve McQueen, Fred Astaire, Faye Dunaway, Paul Newman, Robert Vaughn, Robert Wagner, even O.J. Simpson. For as much as we dump on him for the horrible stuff he did, and rightly so, even he does a pretty good job in this movie. On top of that, the story is at least interesting on a base level. It's basically Die Hard, but instead of terrorists, it's a fire. This not only separates the film from other Die Hard-like movies, as the antagonist is more of a natural force without a human element, but it also gives the film a lot of suspense as you want to see the people evacuating the burning building. And in terms of the effects, they're also really good. While there are certain aspects of The Towering Inferno that haven't aged well, the effects are not one of them. There is one shot where you can clearly tell that it's a painting, but other than that, this film looks gorgeous. Everything is so big and grand, and you really get a sense of the film's scope. It's aged phenomenally. The building itself also looks great. They really managed to make this building look gigantic in scope, and you could easily be fooled into thinking it's a real building. Pretty solid work. But then we get to the stuff that hasn't aged well. Easily the biggest problem with The Towering Inferno is how boring it is. Now, it might seem unlikely for a film about people escaping a giant burning building to be boring, but keep in mind that Towering Inferno was one of the first big-budget disaster movies. Nowadays, most major disaster movies would get straight to the action. But with older films, they took a while to set things up. And that's especially prevalent in T.I. The first half could basically be renamed Talking, the Movie. There are so many scenes of just people talking about random stuff and nothing else happening. And while it's engaging at first due to the actors' great performances, after a while, it just becomes agonizing to watch. And even when the fire starts, they still keep talking. Speaking of the fire, this fire is evidently some sort of new kind of plot convenient fire, because this isn't how fires behave. Like, basically, the fire starts because of an electrical shortage, and it literally just stays in the room. It doesn't spread out to other areas of the building, at least in that moment anyway. It does later on in the film. It just stays in that one room until someone opens the door. Yeah, apparently you can just lock fire inside of a freaking store electrical room. And before anyone gives me flack for criticizing the logic of a 1974 disaster movie, come on, that's just not how fire behaves. You can't just lock fire in a freaking room. And even when the fire goes out, it still doesn't behave right. It constantly avoids the people that are in the room just so they can get out safely. It's really ridiculous and makes the movie laughable. And on top of that, the film just really drags out in the last half. If the first half is talking the movie, the second half is saving people from a fire, the movie. It's just endless scenes of people being saved from the fire, and it gets old after a while. There is literally a scene where they stretch out the saving process to where they spend some time getting the guy up, then come back down, then come back up again. It's just agonizing to watch. But one of the biggest problems with the Towering Inferno is how it just straight up has no focus. With a movie with other natural disaster movies, there's at least a clear focus, like either a character or a group of characters that we put our primary focus on, so that way we can stay invested. But with here, there's nothing like that. Nobody is the main character. They all have an equal amount of time to focus, even freaking random background extras. So that way, so we really don't have anything to latch onto or engage ourselves with, making the film more of a mess than it already is. So yeah, Towering Inferno is a mixed bag, but one you should absolutely watch. It's a very interesting piece of film history, with some strong acting, solid special effects, and enjoyably stupid moments to make up for some of the more boring elements. Again, definitely not a film for everyone, but still an interesting watch that's aged well in some areas and not well in others. Although it definitely aged better than... I don't know if I'd call Die Another Day the worst James Bond movie. Both because I haven't seen every James Bond film and because it has some enjoyably bad elements, but my God, is it bad. For starters, it has the worst Bond theme song. Remember the elegant beauty of Live and Let Die by Paul McCartney? Well, now we have auto-tune garbage from Madonna with meaningless lyrics and horrible vocals. Watch Todd in the Shadows' Train Records on American Life to know more about how badly Madonna was doing at the time. As for the movie itself, the only genuinely good thing about Die Another Day is the acting. Aside from Halle Berry, who gives a very awkward and stilted performance, everyone in this movie does a fairly solid job. Nothing Oscar-worthy, but still decently effective acting nonetheless. Especially John Cleese's Q. This was John's only outing as the character, which sucks because he genuinely does a good, solid job. And that is where my genuine positives end, because my God, this film is a mess. Mahler would have an absolute field day with the amount of plot holes, contrivances, and just plain idiocy that's present in Die Another Day. From the fact that James Bond is able to walk into this high-rise hotel looking like a greasy hobo and get like 100% perfect service, to the fact that all the women in this ice castle are dressed as bare as possible, to the entire conceit of the bone marrow surgery thing. Yeah, sure, movie. Removing the bone marrow can change your entire race. Let's go with that. To how Zhao never gets those diamonds out of his face. It's honestly amazing how full of holes every aspect of Die Another Day is. On top of that, the characters are just kind of eh. Most of them are really forgettable and don't leave a big impression, with the exception of Q, Bond, Jinx, and Graves. Q I already mentioned, so let's start with Bond, played in this version by Pierce Brosnan. Pierce does an okay Bond. He's not as good as Connery or Moore, but Brosnan does at least capture the broad strokes, while still making the character his own. And it's not a role where he has to sing, which is a huge plus, as Pierce Brosnan can't sing well to save his life. And in this film, Brosnan genuinely does the best he can. He at least tries to work with the awful material he's given, and give us an at least passable Bond. But even then, he's not super interesting, and can't capture Moore's iconic awesomeness. Next is Jinx, and dear God, this character. Jinx is basically Anna Kendrick's character from Mr. Right, but slightly more intelligent and slightly less obnoxious. She's an annoying idiot who keeps trying and failing to be funny every 5 minutes, and straight up clashes with the tone so much that it feels like she came from a completely different movie. And like I said, Barry has the only bad performance in Die Another Day. I like Halle Berry, but she is just awful in this movie. Barry just looks completely lost. Her lines have a very stilted, awkward delivery, and while she does have, decent chemistry with Bond, it's not amazing and really does not make up for her shortcomings as a character. Finally, we have Graves, and I have mixed feelings on this character. On the one hand, he's decently menacing. Toby Stephens does a solid job in the role, and he's not, the dumbest villain ever. But on the other hand, this character is nowhere near as good as other Bond villains. He has some off moments, and his entire deal is just so stupid. Basically, Graves isn't really Graves. He's actually Colonel Moon, a rogue North Korean army general who Bond met earlier in the film. And after the whole fiasco that happened at the start of the film, Moon got that bone marrow surgery I mentioned earlier to become Graves. Now, unlike the twist with Andy in Glass Onion, I will admit that this twist isn't exactly cliche, but it's still really dumb. For one, it's the only time that the bone marrow surgery plays into the plot, and even then it's not that necessary. You could change it to where Colonel Moon was wearing a disguise, and the film would play out largely the same. And while Hudson Hawk did something similar with the character of George Kaplan, it was such a small element of the plot that we never saw what Kaplan looked like before the surgery, and it's never really mentioned outside of that one line of dialogue. It didn't have an explanation as stupid as, let's just take out the bone marrow and everything about your face will change. And Hudson Hawk is more farcical in nature, at least intentionally so something like that is easily excusable. Plus, Hudson Hawk is a better film overall. On top of that, the fact that nobody noticed Graves wasn't who he said he was, and the fact that Bond antagonized Graves for no reason just makes no sense. The former might make sense if Graves actually existed and Moon just stole his identity, but no. Graves is just a persona made up by Moon, so the fact that he doesn't actually exist probably should have been discovered at some point. And as for the latter, Graves and Bond first meet in a fencing club after the fencing teacher, played by Madonna, in one of the most pointless cameos of all time, introduces them to each other. And they immediately start antagonizing one another. Now, for Graves antagonizing Bond, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But Bond antagonizing Graves? Why? Sure, we know that Graves is actually Moon, but Bond doesn't. For all Bond knows, Graves is just some random guy, and Bond antagonizing random people doesn't really feel in character for him, regardless of the version. Also, for anyone criticizing Wednesday for not being an accurate portrayal of fencing, watch Die Another Day. I barely even know what fencing is, and I can still tell that Bond and Graves trying to viciously murder each other with fencing swords while damaging various property of the club isn't an accurate portrayal of fencing. Finally, the acting and special effects. They are so bad. The action, while not the worst I've seen in a movie, feels so hollow and empty, really making it hard for the audience to invest in what's going on. And the effects are just awful. I know this was in the early 2000s, so I'm not expecting like Spielberg levels, but they just look so fake and inauthentic, heavily reliant on early 2000s CGI, and feeling so over the top that Moonraker would blush. Seriously, how the frick does a movie that came out in the 70s have gorgeous special effects, whereas something like this that only came out in like the early 2000s looks like a freaking PS1 game? So yeah, Die Another Day is really bad. The plot is stupid and overly complicated. The characters range from to ugh. The action isn't engaging. The effects are laughable. And it's overall just a ridiculous farce of a movie, but not in a good way. Even as a so bad it's good watch, DAD gets tedious after a while. I know this one has its fans, and if you're one of them, great. But I think Die Another Day is just really friggin' bad. It may not be the worst James Bond movie, but it's up there. And now, for an underrated gem that came out the same year as Die Another Day.
Where can you go when skies turn gray, where the sun always shines and the animals play, where every day is a happy day? Well, Smoochie's here to show the way.
This film has been on my radar for a while due to its unorthodox premise and Robin Williams' involvement. After watching it, it's really cool. Death to Smoochie is a perfect example of how to do a dark comedy, as it manages to balance its darker elements with some pretty fun comedy, and the dark stuff is there in order to make a statement instead of just being there for shock value. Let's start with that statement. While there are a lot of interpretations you could make about Death to Smoochie, I personally see it as a satire of cancel culture and the corruption of television. While Rainbow Randolph was a scumbag who deserved to get kicked out, the network he was a part of wasn't necessarily any better. As they generally had the same unsympathetic attitude as Randolph, they just didn't voice it as much. And the only real reason they got Smoochie on board was because his naive and super kind attitude made it so it was unlikely he would be caught in a Randolph-like scandal, showing that the network cares more about appearing good rather than actually being good. And believe me, you'll see an example of that very soon. It's interesting commentary that shows the double-sidedness of Hollywood. On top of that, the characters are great. Let's start with the titular Smoochie, whose real name is Sheldon Mopes. Mopes is the perfect example of how to make a wholesome character. While Mopes does have some Gary Stu elements, he's very kind and caring, only focusing on the integrity of children's entertainment, acting very innocent and naive. What makes him work despite all of that is his humbleness. Unlike, say, Chloe Carmichael from the latter half of The Fairly OddParents, who's very bragging and boastful about her goodness, constantly saying, "Look at me! I'm a good person! Look at me!" Mopes is very humble, and just likes to help others. He starts the film singing in a drug clinic. And while he does accept the deal to turn himself into a TV icon, he doesn't care about all the trappings that come with it. All the merchandise, and all the products, the shows, all the stuff that makes the network money. He just wants to entertain the kids. This makes Mopes a very likable character, as he knows that he's a good person, but focuses more on actually being a good person rather than flaunting how great he is. On top of that, Edward Norton is fantastic in the role. He really captures Mopes' innocence and naivete really well, giving a very sweet and heartfelt performance that makes the character very endearing. And while I will admit that he doesn't go through an enormous arc throughout the movie, the stuff about him really works and makes up for that. So yeah, Mopes is a very sweet character that really makes a great movie even better. The other characters are solid too. Nora is really interesting, starting off very cynical and bitter, but Mopes' wholesomeness manages to help her open up more and realize what made her want to get into television. And Catherine Kinnear is fantastic in the role. Danny DeVito, who also directed the film, is fantastic as sleazy agent Burke Bennett, managing to 100% play to his strengths as an actor and contrast well off of Mopes. While Spinner Dunn's over-the-top stupidity could be annoying for some, I personally don't think it ever got to the point where it was annoying, and his friendship with Sheldon was actually very sweet, and his death was very well handled. Jon Stewart, while not amazing in the role, does bring his trademark charisma and enjoyability as Kidnet executive Marion Frank Stokes. Tommy Cotter is a solidly entertaining character, played really well by Pam Ferris. And then we have Rainbow Randolph, played by comedic legend Robin Williams. Rest in peace. Rainbow Randolph, whose real name is Randolph Smiley, is an incredibly fascinating character. He's pretty much the polar opposite of Mopes, incredibly cynical, bitter, sociopathic, uncaring, and desires what's his and his alone. And like Norton, Williams is phenomenal in the role. Sure, he's incredibly over the top, but A, it's a Robin Williams character. Like 90% of them are over the top. And B, it works for the type of character Smiley is. Where Jack Horner is cartoonishly over the top, to the point where someone like him could only exist in a fictional world, Randolph is a more realistic kind of evil. Definitely over the top, but still someone you could see existing in real life. He starts the movie accepting bribes from parents to let their kids onto his show. He's horrible to everyone around him off camera. He takes advantage of any bit of kindness given to him and ruins it faster than Netflix ruins any chance of being a respected streaming service. And throughout the movie, he tries to constantly debase and defame Smoochie for something that wasn't even his fault. However, near the end of the movie, Randolph does begin to redeem himself, as Sheldon helps him to look inward and realize how corrupt he is and become a lot more empathetic, which Williams also manages to capture really well. Overall, Rainbow Randolph is a very complicated and interesting character that makes a perfect complement to Mopes and serves as a great purpose in the story. Next, we have the comedy, and it's also fantastic. One problem a lot of dark comedies tend to face is that they focus more on the dark than on the comedy. But Death to Smoochie does not suffer from that problem. The comedy in this film is legit really good, from a really enjoyably over-the-top acting, Mopes' wholesomeness contrasting with the cynicism of others, solidly written comedic dialogue, and some truly absurd moments. Easily my favorite is one scene where Randolph sets up Mopes to play at an event that he says is a banquet for an organization dedicated to decency in children's television, but what it is in actuality is so out of left turn and hilariously absurd that when I first saw that scene, I felt a mixture of my jaw dropping and laughing my butt off. I'm not even remotely going to spoil what happens. You have to watch the film. You will have to watch it for yourself. Overall, while the comedy in DTS is definitely an acquired taste, for the right people, it'll definitely get a laugh. Finally, the climax. This climax is amazing. Basically, the TLDR version is that Mopes wants to perform an ice show without any of the commercial trappings, but Burke doesn't like that, so he sets Mopes up by hiring former Kidnet actor Buggy Ding Dong, played really well by Vincent Schiavelli, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, to murder Mopes at the show. This is a fantastic climax. Not only does it show some solid symbolism with how Burke cares more about getting ill-gotten gains than he does about Mopes, but it's the perfect balance of energetic, atmospheric, and funny, capturing the tone beautifully and making a great film even better. Also, it produces two really funny scenes. One where Buggy is upset that the pretzel stand only serves saltless pretzels, and one where one of the police officers asks if Rainbow Randolph is okay, but Randolph says, well, I'm a little messed up in the head already, so it's hard to tell. Overall, Death to Smoochie is a fantastic film. The comedy and dark elements are balanced beautifully. The characters are fantastic. The acting is great, and the commentary is beautifully made. Death to Smoochy absolutely bombed big time when it came out, with even Roger Ebert himself despising the film. But it's gotten a cult following in recent years, and I can see why. Like Hudson Hawk, Death to Smoochy is a film that was made well before its time. And now that several years have passed since it first came out, we can appreciate Death to Smoochy for the brilliant and funny piece of satire that it is. It's certainly not a film for everyone, but if what I've said interested you in any way, give Death to Smoochy a watch. It's free on YouTube, at least at the time of me recording this, and you can get it on almost any streaming service. A fantastic underrated gem of a film that's just as relevant now as it was in 2002.
Well, lovey, darling, come and go with me, come on with me, baby, yonder sea, I need you, darling, so come go with me.
Where do I start with Don't Worry, Darling? I have an idea. Let's start with the good stuff. The film is shot really well. Olivia Wilde only directed one other film before this, Booksmart, which I haven't seen, but heard good things about. And for a second-time director, she is really good at framing shots. For all this movie's faults, it does manage to legit look really good, with some elaborate sets, cinematic framing, great colors, and a unique style. The soundtrack is also pretty solid. Given how this film takes place in the 1950s, there are some 1950s songs on the soundtrack, and they're both really catchy and fit with the atmosphere of the film effectively. Finally, the trip-out sequences. Throughout the film, there are various scenes that are meant to be trippy and weird, and while I have issues with how they fit into the plot, more on that later, on their own they're pretty neat. They have a lot of creativity, uniqueness, and surreal atmosphere to them that makes the film feel immersive. Okay, so that's the good stuff. So what's the bad stuff? Literally everything else. Let's start with the characters. The characters in Don't Worry, Darling are some of the most boring, forgettable, and least engaging characters I've ever seen in a movie. Alice is a very bland main character, with nothing to her outside of main character who needs to get out of a tough situation. Frank is basically Miles from Glass Onion, but more intelligent and without anything that made Miles a good character. And everyone else is just a generic stereotype. And yes, I know that's the point, but that doesn't mean you can't make them interesting. Pleasantville, which is a great movie that I highly recommend checking out, also takes place in a stereotypical 50s world full of stereotypical 50s people, but they still manage to be unique and engaging. But the characters in Don't Worry, Darling are just blank shells of basic character traits that don't even have the likability and fun of the disruptors to make up for their lack of depth. The acting is also a mixed bag, ranging from passable to Olivia. You do realize that second takes are a thing, right? Florence Pugh, Nick Kroll, and Chris Pine have probably the best performances, as while their characters are pretty bland, these three actors try their best to make those characters work. And the scene where Nick Kroll tells one of the other characters to shut up is pretty funny. But most of the other actors, including Olivia Wilde herself, just fall into the not terrible, but nothing spectacular area. Just doing the bare minimum to make the character work. But then there's Harry Styles. A lot of people have mocked Styles' performance in this movie, and I both agree and disagree. On the one hand, Styles isn't an actor, so I'm not entirely mad that his performance turned out the way it did, and I've seen much worse performances from those who actually are actors. But on the other hand, yeah, he sucks in this. Everything Harry Styles does in Don't Worry, Darling just feels so off, but not in the way the movie intends. His mannerisms, voice, and attitudes are just so awkward and uncomfortable, making the movie worse as a result. But by far, the biggest problem with Don't Worry, Darling is the story. DWD is like the bizarro version of Bullet Train, where Bullet Train was a movie where each plot thread was tied up in an incredibly satisfying, sensible, and interesting way. Don't Worry Darling barely explains anything, and the few things it does explain, it explains incredibly poorly. Throughout the film, we get all these surreal events, like earthquakes caused by the Victory Project, Alice crushing eggs that are just eggshells, Alice getting crushed by the walls of her house, Alice watching one of the residents die, but then everyone else thinks she just tripped and is fine, and Alice watching a plane crash, but after going to check it out, wakes up back in her home with nobody mentioning or even knowing about the plane crash. That all sounds really cool, right? Bet you're interested in seeing what it all means, right? Well, too bad. Because the movie never explains any of that. The earthquakes, the plane, the eggshells, the walls. Not a single one of them gets resolved or explained, and both Alice and the movie forget about them immediately after they happen. And they're just there to look cool. It's infuriating. Not just because it's incredibly superficial and disappointing, but because it misses a lot of potential. And again, these scenes are cool, but in isolation. In his review of Incredibles 2, Gaming Magic 13 brought up how the conversation between Helen and Evelyn is cool out of context, but it doesn't tie into the movie at large. And like that conversation, these scenes are really cool out of context, just looking at them as a scene. But when tied to the story, they're absolutely meaningless window dressing. These weird occurrences could have been incredibly interesting and give the movie some new layers, but nope! Let's just forget about them and waste their untapped potential, instead just using it to put shiny keys in front of the audience. The plotting itself is also really bad. The film basically just goes from bland conversation to Alice experiencing something weird, to bland conversation, to Alice experiencing something weird, to bland conversation, to Alice experiencing something weird, to bland conversation, Alice experiencing something weird, until it just randomly decides to start the end to start doing something. It's really shoddily handled, not engaging in the slightest, and just really does not work with what the film is trying to be. And then we have the twist. Now I'm going to spoil the heck out of this movie. So if you don't want any spoilers for whatever reason, go here. Anyways, near the climax of the movie, it's revealed that the town of Victory, California, the main setting of Don't Worry Darling, is not real. It's actually a virtual world created by Frank, who in the real world is this Andrew Tate-like figure. All the men are actually incels who've kidnapped their wives and brainwashed them into thinking that they're 50s women. And when the men go out to do secret work, they're actually going into the real world and getting money to afford to keep their wives like this. There are so many things wrong with this twist that it could honestly be its own separate video. So let's just discuss the main things. First off, it's unoriginal. As much as I hate the twist in Lightyear, at least that twist was interesting. I can't really say I've seen many movies with that particular twist. But with DWD, virtual worlds are just so played out. Obviously, there's the Matrix quadrilogy, but there's also Existence, Serenity, Total Recall, both the 1990 original and the boring as hell 2012 remake, Johnny Mnemonic, Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle and Jumanji The Next Level, The Lawnmower Man, Free Guy, The Cell, Tron, Gamer, Spy Kids 3D Game Over, Brain Scan, Stay Alive, and that awful Lawnmower Man sequel that nobody remembers, just to name a few. And I'd be fine with that if Don't Worry Darling did anything with this concept, but it just doesn't. Victory just feels like any other fictional world, but given the fakest 50s aesthetic ever, because that's all it is, an aesthetic. Going back to Pleasantville, that movie did not just use its 50s vibe as an aesthetic. It took the hokey tropes we associate with the 1950s and used them to create an interesting and unique world that served as a fantastic satire of the squeaky clean Leave It to Beaver type sitcoms of the 1950s, as well as an interesting metaphor about changing and evolving. But in Don't Worry Darling, nothing about this movie screams 50s outside of the outfits, sets, and the lack of modern technology. You could set this in modern times, and very little would actually change. They all talk in modern dialogue. There's no elements of 1950s pop culture. There's just nothing about Don't Worry Darling that makes it need to take place in the 1950s, making this world feel more hollow than it already is. There's also, like, the numerous plot holes that this twist brings up, like, how did nobody notice that Alice disappeared, considering she's a surgeon in the real world? Why did the men go out in the real world to get jobs, despite the fact that they wanted to get into Victory specifically so they could have an easy 1950s living style? Why does Olivia Wilde's character not pay attention to her kids, even though the reason she went into Victory was so she could see her kids? What was up with that scene at the end where Frank's wife stabs him in the chest and then says, "Now it's my turn"? Like, seriously, what the frick is that supposed to mean? And if the kids and people in Victory are all incels and their wives, where did the children and that trolley driver Alice talked to before she investigates the plane crash come from? Again, just to name a few. But the real thing that makes this twist so awful is how it doesn't contribute to anything and serves as a lazy explanation for all the crazy occurrences that are going on. Nothing changes due to this revelation. Nothing new is gained from this realization that everything is virtual. Alice was already in danger. Alice was already trying to get out of Victory. All this twist gives her is an explanation of where she'll end up. And literally every single strange occurrence is explained by, oh, it's a virtual world, it's all because of that. It's lazy, doesn't explain anything, and just tosses all this film's creative potential in the garbage. Absolutely disgusting. And don't even get me started on this film's surface level feminist message that doesn't go beyond incels bad. Like, yeah, incels suck, but like, that's not really a compelling or interesting message. Bottom line, Don't Worry Darling is an utter failure. The characters are bland shells. The plot is a jumbled mess. The messaging is surface level. And the twist is so bad that M. Night Shyamalan would laugh at it. Even the stuff that I like, the soundtrack, the solid directing, and the surreal scenes all contribute to the big problem of Don't Worry Darling. It cares more about aesthetics than about being a good movie. It focuses more on looking good and looking like it has something interesting to say than on actually being good and actually having something interesting to say. And it's sad because Don't Worry Darling could have been a good movie. There is a nugget of potential in DWD that could have resulted in an incredibly interesting, sorry to bother you-esque feminist thriller. But as is, it's just an absolute mess that I only recommend if you're really curious about the Don't Worry Darling drama or you need a movie to riff on with friends. Hopefully, Olivia Wilde does better with her next project, whatever that might end up being. Because Don't Worry Darling is a massive skip. I found out about this movie from Film Brain's Bad Movie Beatdown series. But unlike Film Brain, I friggin' loved it. Strange Wilderness is a movie that looks at the basic concepts of plot, characterization, and taking any amount of anything seriously, and is like, nah, we're not doing that. Sure, there is some semblance of plot, with Peter Gawk, played by the underrated as heck Steve Zahn, and his film crew trying to find Bigfoot in order to save their show, Strange Wilderness, but the film doesn't even remotely take that plot seriously, and basically just uses it as an excuse for gags. And my God, are said gags fantastic. I can certainly understand someone not finding the humor in Strange Wilderness funny, but I personally think these jokes are hilarious. Unlike films like Bucky Larson and The Wrong Missy, which execute lowbrow humor in an incredibly unfunny, boring, and disgusting way, Strange Wilderness's lowbrow jokes are genuinely fun and charming. From ridiculous lines to classic stoner comedy bits to enjoyable personalities playing off each other to hilarious riffing of nature films to easily the funniest moment, the turkey scene. See, at one point of the film, Peter goes to take a piss and sees a turkey. And the turkey attacks Peter, resulting in Peter's dick ending up in the turkey. This scene is so funny. Not only does the concept feel straight out of Freddy Got Fingered, but the pure chaos and comedic banter as Peter's crew and the doctors try to get the turkey off Peter makes an already absurd bit of comedy even more hilarious. The characters are also great. Peter is a very enjoyable main character. Not only does Steve Zahn do a great job in the role, but the character himself is very sympathetic and fun. Sure, he's a bit of a jerk, but it never gets to the point where he becomes hateable, and he has great chemistry with those around him. And his crew is also great, from Lynn Cooker, the equipment manager played by Jonah Hill, who has some funny lines, Junior, the cameraman played by Justin Long, who has some great moments, Whitaker, whose genuine nature not only adds heart to the movie, but also contrasts off the other characters perfectly, Cheryl, who I liked a lot more than I thought I would, as she's very funny and has great chemistry with the guys. And Milos, an old friend of Peter's dad and the original Strange Wilderness cameraman, who's a pretty fun character and is played by Mermaid Man himself, Ernest Borgnine. There's also Bill Calhoun, another old friend of Peter's dad, played phenomenally by the legendary Joe Don Baker. Overall, while I could see the characters in this movie being grating to some people, I personally think they really work. They're very funny on their own and as a collective unit, with a really fun chemistry that makes the audience engage with the movie. Finally, the ending. I'm not going to fully explain what happens, but the short version is that Peter and his crew eventually find Bigfoot, but things don't go as planned. Now, on some level, you could view this ending as anticlimactic. We spend half the movie trying to find Bigfoot, only to lead up to what just happened. Which is what I thought at first. But after thinking about it, it's actually a bit more complex than that. One, what ends up happening is legit funny, and the way they try to solve it is equally funny. And two, it kind of fits with the film's whole deal. As I said before, Strange Wilderness is a film that doesn't even remotely take its plot seriously. So having an ending that makes the whole plot almost pointless kind of makes everything come full circle. Overall, while Strange Wilderness is far from a perfect movie, it's a genuinely fun comedy with likable characters, great humor, and an enjoyably laid-back feel. If you don't like lowbrow humor, you probably won't like this movie. But otherwise, give Strange Wilderness a watch. It's a pretty fun movie that shows for every pile of garbage Happy Madison makes, there's a bright spot.
What is this garbage here? Wanna cover my eyes and plug my ears? It sucks! And that's no lie, it's about as much fun as watching paint dry. Lowers my IQ one notch, and that's the reason why, I can't watch.
Holiday in Handcuffs should be ranked alongside Santa Claus Conquers the Martians and Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2 in terms of so bad it's good Christmas movies. Because, my God, is this film enjoyably insane. Let's start with the basic premise. So, Holiday in Handcuffs is about Trudy Chandler, played by Melissa Joan Hart, who also played Sabrina in the fantastic 90s iteration of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Trudy is a waitress that wants to be a painter, although her wanting to be a painter is barely touched upon. So while at the restaurant she works for, Trudy's boyfriend Nick breaks up with her because he's a cartoonish a-hole. But Trudy is going to spend Christmas with her family and they want to see Nick. Quite the conundrum, eh? Well, before I explain exactly what Trudy does to solve this, I'll let you guess. Does she? A, tell the truth to her family that Nick broke up with her. B, lie and say that Nick couldn't make it for whatever reason. C, call her family to tell her that she couldn't make it for whatever reason. Or D, bail on the family reunion altogether. Let's see what you guys think. Got your answer locked in? Good. Because they're all wrong. You want to know what Trudy actually does? She goes to one of the restaurant patrons, David Martin, played by Mario Lopez, takes out her boss's gun, and proceeds to kidnap David and force him to pretend to be Nick. And yes, that's the plot. Trudy kidnaps a guy and forces him to pretend to be her boyfriend. Merry Christmas! Now, ordinarily, I would despise a film that has this much of a gender double standard. And don't get me wrong, I do hate certain aspects, especially that BS ending. But at the same time, the way Holiday in Handcuffs takes this horrifying concept and tries and fails to make it all cutesy and wacky is just so fascinatingly insane. The film desperately tries to paint Trudy like she's in the right, and that it was a simple misunderstanding, completely ignoring the severity of her actions and how they affect others, using incredibly dumb justifications like, she's just misunderstood and needs to be accepted by her family, and David's girlfriend is a B-word, so it's okay for Trudy to kidnap him. No, movie, that's not good justification for her actions. She kidnapped someone! On top of that, the dialogue is genuinely insane. Imagine if an interdimensional cable skit from Rick and Morty took itself seriously. That is pretty much what 90% of the dialogue in this film is like. Everybody in this movie, with the exception of David, has these incredibly bizarre lines of dialogue that feel incredibly weird and alien. But you can't really pinpoint why. They just don't feel like normal human dialogue. As for the characters, woof. David and Trudy's friend Lucy are literally the only normal people in this movie, but Lucy isn't in it a lot, and while David, for the most part, is aware of and calls out the ridiculousness on screen, even he's not immune from this film's stupidity, as he barely puts in any effort in actually escaping from his kidnapper, and ends up falling in love with her in what I like to call perfect ammo to refute anyone claiming that Beauty and the Beast is a story about Stockholm Syndrome. As for Trudy and her family, they're genuinely insane. Trudy basically has two modes: likable sitcom heroine and actual psychopath. During the first half of HIH, Trudy is portrayed as a typical everywoman, and while not as likable as the film wants her to be, in these moments Trudy is decent. Like, we can identify with trying and failing to get a job in her view. She does come off as a bit desperate, but she doesn't exemplify any psychotic tendencies, at least in these moments. But then when Trudy pulls the gun on David, she just goes downhill. The film constantly flip-flops between treating her like a relatable heroine and treating her like the psychopath that she is, and making for a confusing character mainly carried by the likable charisma of Melissa Joan Hart. As for her family, the Chandlers have to be like the most awkward fictional family ever. They're not as rude or terrible as the Thrombies, but they're just very bizarre, and almost every scene with them feels hilariously uncomfortable. But the grandmother admittedly has some funny moments. Also, they have a rule where they collect all their cell phones and let someone dubbed the Keymaster keep them. Pretty much just so David will have trouble calling for help. I love when people do stupid things just so the plot can happen. Then we have David's fiancée, Jessica, who basically serves as the justification for Trudy's actions. Throughout the film, she's shown as a stuck-up B-word who doesn't actually care about David, and the film acts like that's justification for Trudy kidnapping him, which...
No.
Like, yeah, she's a bit of a jerk, but again, Trudy kidnapped David. I think kidnapping is worse than being kind of a jerk. And then there's this old man who works at a gas station. Even in a movie full of weird characters, this old guy, still manages to be the weirdest character. He just has these really weird mannerisms, this bizarre attitude, and something about him that just feels at odds with the rest of the movie. Finally, the tone. This movie's tone is all over the place. I can't decide between being a dark comedy and being a Hallmark Christmas movie. It's a really odd tonal juxtaposition that makes the film even weirder than it already is. Overall, Holiday in Handcuffs is a bad movie, but it's amazingly bad. Where Die Another Day is a by-the-numbers spy film, And Don't Worry, Darling is a rage-inducing missed opportunity. Holiday in Handcuffs is a train wreck that you can't look away from. It exists on the same level as films like Christmas with the Cranks, Kirk Cameron Saving Christmas, and Lady in the Water. Films whose every decision is just so amazingly wrong that they circle back around to being so bad it's good. I can definitely understand the gender double standard pissing some people off, but I absolutely implore you to watch this holiday disaster piece. This is cult classic material. This needs to be ranked in the Bad Christmas Movie Bible. It is just a perfect blend of awkwardness, incompetence, conflicting tones, and overall WTFery that only comes once in a blue moon. But if you want a genuinely good Christmas movie, then let's wrap things up with...
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Where The Towering Inferno was solid for the time but hasn't aged great, Miracle on 34th Street has aged phenomenally. Let's start with easily the best part, Edmund Gwenn as Santa Claus, aka Kris Kringle. This dude is like if the idea of wholesomeness was a person. He's incredibly kind, helpful, empathetic, and only uses violence when it's absolutely necessary. The only rude action he does in the entire movie is whack a guy on the head with his cane. And even then, he 100% deserved it. Like Sheldon Mopes from Death to Smoochie, Kris is a perfect example of how to make a wholesome character, as he's an incredibly humble, sweet man who just wants to make the world a better place. Gwen just does a great job capturing the wholesomeness of Santa, and he really makes the character leap off the screen. The other characters are fantastic as well. Doris Walker and Fred Galley are very likable and enjoyable. They contrast each other well, with Doris being more stuck and orderly, and Fred being more outspoken. And both Maureen O'Hara and Fred Walker are absolutely fantastic in their portrayals of the characters. Although their romance is kind of unintentionally awkward at certain points. But that's just... yeah. And Doris's daughter, Susan, is absolutely fantastic. She's played by Natalie Wood, who would go on to play Maria in the original West Side Story. And like in that movie, Wood does a really good job. Basically, Doris has raised Susan to be rational and not believe in or participate in childish activities, which resulted in Susan being more grown up and disbelieving. And Wood manages to capture Susan's characteristics accurately, without her ever becoming annoying. She's incredibly adult for her age, but still acts like a regular kid. And it's cool to see a child actor capture that balance. Neat stuff. The film is also decently funny. While Miracle on 34th Street isn't a full comedy, it does have some decently funny moments, like solid lines, enjoyable contrasting of different characters, exaggerated personalities, and pretty good timing. And also the scene where Doris and Fred find out Kris really is Santa Claus is also freaking hilarious. Again, comedy is not a strong focus on Miracle on 34th Street, but what comedy there is fairly effective. But what really makes MO34 such a great movie is its heart. There's just such an adorable genuineness to Miracle on 34th Street. Not only reflects its wholesome interpretation of Santa Claus, but makes it an enduring Christmas classic to this day. Honestly, what even is there left to say about Miracle on 34th Street? It's freaking amazing! It's an incredibly sweet, fun, charming, and wholesome holiday classic that's endured for many years. This movie came out in 1947, making it currently the oldest film I have ever reviewed, and yet has aged better than multiple movies made today. The characters are great, the comedy is solid, the script is enjoyable, and it's just such a warm and fuzzy movie. An absolute classic that I can't recommend enough. And with that, this mini reviews is over. Comment your thoughts on these movies as well as anything cool you saw, and tune in for more content coming soon. There are actually a lot of movies this year that I'm really excited to cover. And I recently saw Megan, so stay tuned for a review of that movie sometime in the near future. But till next time, this is Jeremy signing off. Adios.